Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off and where the Red Fern Grows, Billy nearly lost little Anne in the icy river while coon hunting with her and old Dan. I wonder what's going to happen next. Are their lives going to be put at stake again? We shall see. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Another thing, counting the pages in this book, we are officially halfway through, page-wise. Chapter 12. The fame of my dogs spread all over our part of the Ozarks. They were the best in the country. No coon hunter came into my grandfather's store with as many pelts as I did. Grandpa never overlooked an opportunity to brag. He told everyone the story of my dogs and the part he had played in getting them. Many was the time some farmer coming to our home would say, "Your grandpa was telling me you got 3 big coons over in Peavine Hollow the other night." I would listen, knowing I only got 1, or maybe none, but Grandpa was my pal. If he said I caught 10 in one tree, it was just that way. Because of my grandfather's bragging and his firm belief in my dogs and me, a terrible thing happened. Oh, God. One morning while having breakfast, Mama said to Papa, "I'm almost out of cornmeal. Do you think you can go to the mill today?" Papa said, "I intended to butcher a hog. We're about out of meat." Looking at me, he said, "Shell a sack of corn. Take one of the mules and go to the mill for your mother." With the help of my sisters, we shelled the corn. Throwing it over the mule's back, I started for the door. On arriving at the mill house, I tied my mule to the hitching post, took my corn, and set it by the door. I walked over to the store and told Grandpa I just wanted to get some corn ground. He said, "I'll be with you in just a minute." As I was waiting, I heard a horse coming. Looking out, I saw who it was and didn't like what I saw. It was the 2 youngest Pritchard boys. I had run into them on several occasions during pie suppers and dances. The Pritchards were a large family that lived upriver about 5 miles. As in most small country communities, there is one family that no one likes. The Pritchards were it. Tales were told that they were bootleggers, thieves, and just all-round quote-unquote no accounts. The story had gone round that old man Pritchard had killed a man somewhere in Missouri before moving to our part of the country. Rubin was 2 years older than I, big and husky for his age. He never had much to say. He had mean-looking eyes that were set far back in his rugged face. They were smoky-hued and unblinking, as if the eyelids were paralyzed. I had heard that once he had cut a boy with a knife in a fight over at the sawmill. Rainie was the youngest, about my age. He had the meanest disposition of any boy I had ever known. Because of this, he was disliked by young and old. Wherever Rainie went, trouble seemed to follow. He was always wanting to bet, and would bet on anything. He was nervous, and could never seem to stand still. Once at my grandfather's store, I had given him a piece of candy. Snatching it out of my hand, he ate it and then sneered at me and said it wasn't any good. During a pie supper one night, he wanted to bet a dime that he could whip me. My mother told me always to be kind of Rainie, that he couldn't help being the way he was. I asked, why? She said it was because his brothers were always picking on him and beating him. On entering the store, they stopped and glared at me. Rubin walked over to the counter. Rainie came over to me. Leering at me, he said, "I'd like to make a bet with you." I told him I didn't want to bet. He asked if I was scared. "No, I just don't want to bet," I said. His neck and ears looked as though they hadn't been washed in months. His ferret-like eyes kept darting here and there. Glancing down to his hands, I saw the back of his right sleeve was stiff and starchy from the constant wiping of his nose. He saw I was looking him over and asked if I liked what I saw. I started to say no, but didn't, turned and walked away a few steps. Rubin ordered some chewing tobacco. "Aren't you a little young to be chewing?" Grandpa said. "Ain't for me, it's for my dad," Rubin growled. Grandpa handed 2 plugs to him. He paid for it, turned around, and handed 1 plug to Rainie. Holding the other up in front of him, he looked it over. Looking at Grandpa, he gnawed at one corner of it. Grandpa mumbled something about how kids were brought up these days. He came from behind the counter saying to me, "Let's go grind that corn." The Pritchard boys made no move to follow us out of the store. "Come on," Grandpa said. "I'm going to lock up till I get this corn ground." "We'll just stay here. I want to look at some shirts," said Rubin. "No, you won't," said Grandpa. "Come on, I'm going to lock up." Begrudgingly, they walked out. I helped Grandpa start the mill, and we proceeded to grind the corn. The Pritchard boys had followed us and were standing looking on. Rainie walked over to me. "I hear you have some good hounds," he said. I told him I had the best in the country. If he didn't believe me, he could just ask my grandfather. He just leered at me. "I don't think they're half as good as you say they are," he said. "Bet our old blue tick hound can outhunt both of them." I laughed. "Ask Grandpa who brings in the most hides." "I wouldn't believe him. He's crooked," he said. I let him know right quick that my grandfather wasn't crooked. "He's a storekeeper, ain't he?" he said. I glanced over at Grandpa. He had heard the remark made by Rainie. His friendly old face was as red as a turkey gobbler's wattle. Uh-oh. The last of my corn was just going through the grinding stones. Grandpa pushed a lever to one side, shutting off the power. He came over and said to Rainie, "What do you do?" "Just go around looking for trouble." "What do you want, fat?" Rubin sidled over. "This ain't none of your business," he said. "Besides, Rainie's not looking for a fight. We just want to make a bet with him." Grandpa glared at Rubin. "Any bet you would make sure would be a good one, all right. What kind of bet?" Rubin spat a mouthful of tobacco juice on the clean floor. He said, "Well, we've heard so much about them hounds of his, we just think it's a lot of talk and lies. We'd like to make a little bet, say about $2. I had never seen my old grandfather so mad. The red had left his face. In his place was a sickly paste-gray color. The kind old eyes behind the glasses burned with a fire I had never seen. In a loud voice, he asked, "Bet on what?" Rubin spat again. Grandpa's eyes followed the brown stain in its arch until it landed on the clean floor and splattered. With a leering grin on his dirty old face, Rubin said, "Well, we got an old coon up in our part of the country that's been here a long time. Ain't no dog yet ever been smart enough to tree him, and Rainie broke into the conversation. "He ain't just an ordinary coon, he's an old-timer. Folks call him the ghost coon. Believe me, he is a ghost. He just runs hounds long enough to get 'em all warmed up and then climbs a tree and disappears. Our old blue hound has treed him more times than—" Rubin looked at Rainie to shut up and tell him to do and let him do the talking. Looking over me, he said, "What do you say? Want to bet $2 your hounds can tree him?" I looked at my grandfather. He didn't help me. I told Rubin I didn't want to bet, but I was pretty sure my dogs could tree the ghost coon. Rainie butted in again. "What's the matter, you yellow?" I felt the hot blood rush into my face. My stomach felt like something alive was crawling in it. I doubled up my right fist and was on the point of hitting Rainie in one of his eyes when I felt my grandfather's hand on my shoulder. I looked up. His eyes flashed as he looked at me. A strange little smile was tugging at the corner of his mouth. The big artery in his neck was pounding out and in. It reminded me of a young bird that had fallen out of a nest and lay dying on the ground. Still looking at me, he reached back and took his billfold from his pocket, saying, "Let's call that bet," turning to Rubin. Turning to Rubin, he said, "I'm going to let him call your bet, but now you listen. If you boys take him up there to hunt the ghost coon and jump on him and beat him up, you're sure going to hear from me. I don't mean maybe. I'll have both of you taken to Tahlequah and put in jail. You'd better believe that." Reuben saw he had pushed my grandfather far enough. Backing up a couple of steps, he said, "We're not going to jump on him. All we want to do is make a bet." Grandpa handed me two $1 bills, saying to Reuben, "You hold your money and he can hold his. If you lose, you'd better pay off." Looking back to me, he said, "Son, if you lose, pay off." I nodded my head. I asked Reuben when he wanted me to come up for the hunt. He thought a minute. "You know where that old log slide comes out from the hills onto the road?" he asked. I nodded. "We'll meet you there tomorrow night about dark," he said. It was fine with me, I said, but I told him not to bring his hounds because mine wouldn't hunt with other dogs. He said he wouldn't. I agreed to bring my axe and lantern. As they turned to leave, Rainie smirked. "Sucker!" he cried. I made no reply. After the Pritchard boys had gone, my grandfather looked at me and said, "Son, I have never asked another man for much, but I sure want you to catch the ghost coon." I told him if the ghost coon made one track in the river bottoms, my dogs would get him. Grandpa laughed. "You better be getting home. It's getting late and your mother is waiting for the cornmeal," he said. I could hear him chuckling as he walked towards his store. I thought to myself, there goes the best grandpa a boy ever had. Lifting the sack of meal to the back of my old mule, I started for home. All the way I kept thinking of old Dan, little Ann, ghost coons, and the two ugly, dirty Pritchard boys. I decided not to tell my mother and father anything about the hunt, for I knew Mama wouldn't approve of anything I had to do with the Pritchards. The following evening I arrived at the designated spot early. I sat down by a red oak tree to wait. I called little Ann over to me and had a good talk with her. I told her how much I loved her, scratched her back, and looked at the pads of her feet. "Sweetheart," I said, "you must do something for me tonight. I want you to tree the ghost coon, for it means so much to Grandpa and me." She seemed to understand, and answered by washing my face and hands. I tried to talk to old Dan,